back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Manchester City versus West Ham in the Premier League. So this video will also be made using keyframe. I'll put the link in the description below so you guys can check it out if you want to potentially get this software to create high quality content at an affordable price. So let's get right into it because there's a lot to talk about. City lined up with their two central defenders. Look like these two center defenders are in favor right at the moment with Pep between Diaz and John Stones. Then Zinchenko started as left fullback, Walker as the right. And now in the midfield we have Fernandinho, De Bruyne, Aguero coming into the Gabriel Jesus false nine role, but obviously Aguero plays it quite differently, and Gundogan stays in the midfield as well. So from here, we can look at just first the interactions between the fullbacks. Zinchenko coming in inverted most of the time off the left fullback position and coming alongside Fernandinho. So without Zinchenko, it would have been a diamond formation in the midfield around the 5-3-2 of West Ham. So, but most of the time it would be a double pivot with Fernandinho, and then this would give De Bruyne more variability in his movements to go into the wide areas, use the half space, or if that was Gundogan on that side, it would be just a more flexible structure, whereas Kyle Walker was typically a deeper role, and then as they moved into the final third, Walker would also invert as a counter-pressing structure to cover the press in front of him and solidify circulation. But from West Ham, they played a 5-3-2, and this was quite clever because the three players in midfield would oftentimes be blocking the players between the lines for Manchester City. So the three-man midfield would often line up against the three advanced players from Manchester City. Here, the structure is a bit different between Antonio covering Fernandinho, the holding midfielder, and with Zinchenko not quite inverted yet. So their structure is a bit different here, with Antonio dropping deeper, covering the holding pivot, and the two wider players, Lingard being one of them, pressing the ball more narrow to prevent access to the low density wide areas. So now we take a look. Zinchenko has now inverted, and we start to see the dynamics of the Manchester City team in possession with their 2-3 shape in the midfield with the two holding pivots and three advanced players. And the biggest difference between Aguero coming back into the side is now they have a player higher up playing the blind side of the defenders. So what this does for Manchester City is it creates a little bit less variability in their movements because Aguero is more comfortable playing in the more advanced roles in behind the defense. So this will pin some of the defenders, one or two of them, depending on the situation, into a deeper position, which can create more space between the lines. So with that being said, sometimes when Gabriel Jesus plays in this role, he'll often occupy the 10 position right away, which forces defenders to make a decision when they should jump or when they should stay, whereas starting higher already makes the decision for the defenders by pinning them and prevents access. And now we can see the man orientation from West Ham in the mid block, just creating access to each of the advanced midfielders. In this case, it's the four-man midfield, and with Jesse Lingard at the height, with Antonio then a little off center. So from here, they would go higher up the field into a more man-orientated system to prevent access to the free player between the lines or in advanced areas. And as they move deeper, it was much more spatial control with their 5-3-2 and compactness controlling the central three corridors. But from here, we have the Manchester City advanced shape set up, and now we can look at their base structure. using a little bit asymmetry in terms of their occupation of the central three corridors in the initial phase, as well as asymmetry in the height of the players. Kyle Walker had the tendency to stay a little bit higher, putting him in a better position to then progress the ball via dribbling and put him in closer proximity to the advanced midfielder. Because as we see the distance between Kyle Walker, by maintaining his position a little bit higher and a little bit narrow, it puts him in a closer proximity to Gundogan, as well as we can see on the flip side, the positioning of Diaz puts him in a much larger distance in between him and De Bruyne in the left half space. So here is a tactical cam picture of just a Manchester City setup, and we can see the midfielders quite clearly here and how narrow they get, and this is also a really good picture for the West Ham defensive setup. We have now Kyle Walker just playing a little bit higher than the two central defenders through the asymmetry, and now we can even see the space created between the wide player and the left central defender from Manchester City. And this is the space that I was talking about by playing asymmetrically in the first line of build-up, creates different dynamics. As we see here, we have almost a rondo situation with a four-man structure versus the isolated weak side, so a little bit of overload and isolate. The isolated weak side is on his own, looking to take advantage of qualitative superiority against the West Ham wingback. So, as we see here. So, if West Ham was lined up in a 4-2-3-1 initially in their possession phase, the wide players in the three advanced roles would be the players who would turn into wingbacks, with Cresswell dropping deeper as a central defender, so the left midfielder would then become a left wingback, creating the back five. So as we look at this, we can look at further West Ham structure, and especially now how they use their three-man midfield in the defensive phase to try and null the effect of the players between the lines from Manchester City. So as we see here, the three-man midfield from West Ham pretty much generates a big amount of spatial control between the lines, as we see here, to avoid progression through the central corridors, and this just makes the shifting easier and covering in wide areas much easier than if their structure was exposed through the central corridors, and it gives City access to less dangerous space. So now again, looking at the variability of Kyle Walker's initial positioning, he starts deeper now, creating more of a symmetric back three, a little bit off-centered just because to create the diagonal passing options between the two holding midfielders and the holding midfielders' potential to move into a deeper line. But from here, we also see now that De Bruyne taking up the 10 position, Aguero playing in the left half space, puts them in a more typical structure to what we've seen from a Manchester City side in the past 3 to 5 games, with not playing with a player in behind the defense, but rather playing with 3 players between the lines, asking more questions of these players in the defensive roles to then determine how they're going to respond. So we can even highlight the defensive setup from West Ham in their 5-3-2. We have our 3 midfielders using their cover shadows to block access to the three advanced players. And one important concept is vertical partnerships in a situation like this. So the ball is with Zinchenko, the defender and the midfielder in closest proximity to the ball would then jump, and by having a three center backs and two wing backs, this creates more potential for the wide center back to then jump with his vertical partner in the central midfield, and thus maintaining this high level of spatial control between the lines. So not only if a defender or a deeper player pulls out a midfielder from the midfield line, they still have the potential to create the vertical partnership to maintain this high level of spatial control within the team. So now looking at West Ham on the ball, as we see the mention of Cresswell earlier, he's now playing as a fullback. But we see now just using the goalie slightly in the build-up and on the weak side, almost creating a back four in the initial phase. We have our double pivot, Souček and Declan Rice. Declan Rice often favored the left half space, dropping into a deeper, wider position in the left half space as a deep line playmaker to try and disbalance the Manchester City 4-4-2 without the ball, as we see here. Gundogan and Aguero, the highest players, Mahrez, and now we see the staggering from Manchester City. And oftentimes it's very much option-oriented, meaning that we'll often see players with multiple connections, dual roles in players. As we see here, use of the cover shadow from Gundogan to try and block access to the central area, Declan Rice, and maintaining access but not man orientation. So when the ball arrives in the wide area, they would be able to go and press, and pretty much all the options are taken care of. A little bit, I've noticed there's a little bit of space in the Manchester City team when the near side central defending midfielder, when he's deeper and the forwards go to press, sometimes there's vacated space in the pivot area, which can be a sign of a central pressing trap or a disconnected team. So potentially a weak point for Manchester City there if teams can accurately exploit this space. But moving forward, we see the spatial orientation from Manchester City and the 4-4-2, the staggering of the players with Fernandinho, who is the deepest midfielder. And now, by playing a little bit higher up the field in this situation, it creates the tendency for passes to open up from the central corridor through diagonal options into the half space, which made players like Jesse Lingard or other advanced players very dangerous by creating positional superiority between the lines and the potential for blindside movements with players up top like Antonio to then pin the two central defenders and then exploit this space when Manchester City open up in their high block. So now we see Declan Rice dropping deeper in the left half space from his pivot position. Souček then takes up the most central role. And now a really important concept in a relationship between Jesse Lingard and Antonio. This was a typical trend, especially in the left half space when Declan Rice would drop deeper. They would often have an overload in one side of the field, as we see here. So Antonio pinning the defenders while Jesse Lingard is positioned between two Manchester City midfielders, which would then allow him to affect both players and create the potential for a blindside movement. In this situation, Man City cover it well with cover shadows and their overall compactness, but with these players playing between the lines, we can often see that relationships come into a big role between players in advanced positions and the wide area, as we see here, trying to create a 2 versus 1 versus on the weak side they use an asymmetric conceptual playing model with Antonio and Jesse Lingard playing in their more vertical line, creating overload to try and exploit their movement and then the wide structure begins to show with Cresswell as well between these three players, as we see here. So now Manchester City building from the back. We often saw John Stones alongside Ederson in their initial first line pass, with Ruben Diaz taking up a lower density area in the left wide area, almost as like a deeper fullback because of the inverting of Zinchenko alongside Fernandinho. And the use of cover shadows from West Ham and pressing Manchester City into wide areas while using cover shadows looked to try and exploit the Manchester City possession and create isolation around the ball when the ball entered the wide area through a player like Kyle Walker, as we see here. But oftentimes, because of the City structure and their range of passing, they often were able to create positional superiority through a false nine and players running in behind the defense in an overstretched position. So they weren't really afraid to go long or use blindside movements. As we can see from Manchester City or Fernandinho here, if Fernandinho were to create blindside movements to move higher or deeper to get out of the cover shadow of Jesse Lingard, that was always a possibility as well. And creating this variation made them very hard to defend against for West Ham. So now the ball goes into the wide area, as we said. West Ham look to isolate possession, players jumping and using their cover shadow, as well as just creating access rather than man orientation. So they're still in a position like Souček and Declan Rice to drop and collect the second ball if need be, or to drop in a fast transition if the ball were played beyond them, as well as a player like Jesse Lingard here creating dual access with his cover shadow and blocking any central pass from the wide area. So now with the ball going in behind, we can see the false nine positioning of Aguero dropping between the lines in midfield. And in the same sequence as we saw in the last frame, we have both wingers making then narrow runs from the half spaces into the central corridor, which creates the positioning of West Ham to be under stress, because with the defender having to worry about Aguero as well as the runs in behind, it puts them under a lot of stress and forces them to create decisions, as we see the other two midfielders now, De Bruyne and Gundogan, connecting with Aguero dropping deeper, allowing the narrow runs of the wingers in behind when West Ham stepped out in their high block. So now, a few more pictures here, not much longer. When Manchester City were entering the final third, we talked about earlier Kyle Walker then jumping in line with the holding midfielders to create almost a 2-3 asymmetric rest defense shape and for circulation as well, just to put them in closer proximity to the West Ham midfield three, as we see here, and allowed them to cover the players in further positions, allowing them to counter press that much quicker. And De Bruyne, as we said, with Kyle Walker, the asymmetry in their side, Kyle Walker's the player occupying this right half space, but that creates the potential for De Bruyne to then just drop deeper, play in a deeper role as a deep line playmaker if he chose to do so and if the space was there. So as the wide midfielder of West Ham steps, this then creates the potential for De Bruyne to access this space and progress past the midfield of West Ham as Zinchenko's on the ball, drawing the West Ham midfielder out of position. So as we see here, De Bruyne uses a blindside movement to then progress past, and I wanted to show this picture because of the positioning of Aguero and how it can differentiate between a player like Gabriel Jesus, with him playing in an offside position, trying to stretch the back line, creating more space for players like De Bruyne to make these blindside movements against the midfield three from West Ham. But potentially the problem is here with the three center defenders. They're more likely to jump into this position, thus creating still a high level of spatial control, but something to think about nonetheless, and just pointing out Kyle Walker, again creating the asymmetry in the team's positioning. So now, one more look at the West Ham setup. We have here the setup for a back three, missing the weak side player. That will be filled by a player like Declan Rice, dropping deeper to then create this back three, and then Souček would then become the holding midfielder. And we can also see how the team is set up. Again, one for the first line passes to create a rondo situation around the ball, and to draw the Manchester City players further forward to invite the press, and players like Jesse Lingard and Antonio are occupying advanced spaces to then complete the overload and draw Manchester City to one side or progress through the overload, but always having the circulation option and the weak side low density area to then fall back on. And then just highlighting Manchester City's defensive setup, because their spacing between the players is quite good, and their cheating of their outside midfielders is also good, to take the fullbacks out of the picture by creating access in these higher areas while maintaining their horizontal connections to players in the half spaces and in the 10 area. So now, as we saw, the first two Manchester City players were taken out of the picture. So the player for West Ham then progresses the ball, and the main situation that we want to look at from here was the relationship, as we talked about, between Jesse Lingard and Antonio, with Antonio then remaining stagnant or dropping deeper towards the ball, which would then create the positioning advantage for Jesse Lingard to make this run from a deeper area in behind when Antonio draws out a center back, or if Jesse Lingard was tracked and Antonio was free, Antonio would be able to use as a target player or as a player to create combinations through when advancing past the Manchester City structure. And that's the analysis, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed the game, and I'll get back to everyone with another analysis video probably tomorrow, and I'll see you then.